Yeah, what a morning we've had. What a rich morning we've had so far. I feel honored to be a part of this place. And I learned something from Bernie today, well, among uh, many things, really, but that barbers and preachers have a lot in common. They make up stories, and stories grow. And my dad was a preacher. And I was thinking about him this morning because on the way to C3, I passed his old church. My dad was a pastor at Calvary Church in Grand Rapids. And it's the pyramid, which looks like a pyramid. And we used to wonder as kids, like, who's entombed in there? Um, they even have a hall of dead people. That's what I call it. It's like pictures of pastors, and they're all dead. Um, anyway, it's a bit of a creepy wall. But anyway, I was thinking about him this morning as I was pulling in, and I remember when I was in junior high, I was sitting there with my friend Michael Hidalgo, and my dad was giving a talk, and I leaned over and I said, "Does this sound um, like this is a talk how awesome Calvary Church is?" He's like, "Yeah, it does sound like that." I was like, "This is not about the Bible. This is like how awesome we are as a church." And so, being in junior high, my friend Michael said quite loudly in the pews, he's like, "Calvary Church is one hell of a church, yeah!" And I mean, he said it like in that quiet, loud way of junior high, trying to be quiet, but was obviously loud. So I'm saying that because today, my talk, I want to talk about C3 is one hell of a spiritual community. So this is my one hell of a spiritual community chat today. And actually the territory we've already been covering, just hearing from different people's voices and from different kinds of music and different words and different writers, and is part of what makes this place unique and special. And I've been thinking about this month for a while. In fact, I've been planting seeds for the month of March, really, for the last at least month or so. I've been priming the pump and probing your imaginations and getting you to think and write about stuff. And all that was just part of stirring the cauldron, because I want to have a conversation about, hey, what do you guys want to do in the next couple years as you look forward? And one of the things that makes this place unique is that things bubble up from beneath, not necessarily from the top. And in other words, your voice matters and your ideas matter, and ideas are very fragile. And sometimes they're like caged animals and they need to be coaxed out and just heard and given a little life. And sure enough, you find yourself, once you hear other people's ideas and passions and stories, you feel drawn to them. And so that's kind of the train I want to cover for the month of March. And today's going to be a little bit different because I want to talk about our vision. I want to remind us of our values. And I want to do that because I want it to poke and prod your own creativity. For what would you like to see in the next year or so? What would you like C3 to be involved in the next year or so? I mean, and what if you didn't attach dollar limits to that, or you talked yourself out of it thinking something like we all do, well, I could never make that happen. But you let your imagination run a bit. I want to do that today, and I'm going to give you some homework, so we're back in school. And hopefully you'll be back here next week, and if not, you should hand your ideas off to someone who will be here next week, because we want to, in the talk back time, bring some of those ideas forward and find a way of sifting and sorting and see which ones occur to us as being some of the more interesting ones that we can rally around. All ideas are interesting, I suppose, but I think we'll have a sense. We'll talk about how we'll process through that, but we want to see if 2 or 3 or 4 ideas might emerge that might have some practical legs to them. And if you don't stop every once in a while and say, hey, where are we going? Or what would you like to see happen? Then we might miss some really good things that might surface. So that's the big picture. Have I made sense so far? So I want to remind us of our values, of the vision. And the way it's stated on the website is sort of a bit of a poetic way of saying it, but I want to read it here. C3 is a vibrant, values-based community in an evolving world that inspires and empowers. So it inspires and empowers members in their quest to live a good life and to seek the good life of other people as well. It's not in this sentence, but that's part of our larger vision. We, in turn, engage and support others in their work for justice and compassion everywhere. It's important to bring words to the surface. It's important to try to state something, especially, and I'm a Gen X, postmodern kind of Eddie Vedder fan, where you don't like to say anything at all, or you like to say it with a wink, and it might be cynical, and hey, it could be wrong, who knows? Especially in that kind of culture, it's important to try to say, hey, this is what we think we're about. And what I love about the vision statement, just saying something like we empower people to live the good life, is it forces us to ask, what do we mean by that? Correct? What do we mean by that? And that's a pretty bold statement to make in a world where truth tends to get flattened out. That's what Ken Wilber says. He calls it flatland. And yeah, what do you think that means? I think it's worth you all spending some time with. What do you mean by that? What do you mean by the good life? And how might you empower and inspire yourself and others to live such a thing? And then we flesh it out a bit by saying, in the second half, we in turn engage and support others in their work for justice and compassion everywhere. So we're already beginning to define a little bit of what we think the good life looks like. Justice and compassion, at least an element as we're trying to define it communally. And a vision statement / mission statement, I know you can be technical about these things, but one of the things I like about calling it a kind of vision statement is that we're saying it's true and we're also saying we hope it's true. It's visionary in the sense of, do you know that we live in a world where justice and compassion is not available to all people? Yes. Do you know that many people are not empowered or inspired to live a good life, or even the best life that they can live? So in that sense, by having it as a vision statement, the work is never done. And we have to remind ourselves, oh yeah, that's why we're coming together. That's why. It's nice to come together. A lot of us, we have traumatic stories. We have hang-ups with this and that, and it's nice to be in a welcoming room, which this is. This is a welcoming place, at least in my view. And also, we don't want it to just be that. We want it to be that and more. That's sort of a visionary way of looking at things. And one of the things that I found interesting here personally is that that I learned right away is you all were saying we're a values-based community, not really a belief or doctrine-oriented community. I thought, that's interesting. That's a bit of an experiment to see if that works. And it works. How do we know? You're here. So it works enough. But it is quite different because, as you know, doctrines and beliefs, they can create fairly obvious fences. Here's where we are. But when you start talking about values, the fences aren't as solid, at least at first. And so there's some anxiety that potentially can come with that. But I thought, this is interesting. And we also know, and I think this is part of the gift of the existential philosophers and the depth psychologists, just because you say you believe something doesn't really tell you very much. A lot of people say they believe a lot of things. And I'm that way. That's why I wanted to throw in a little of the Ken Wilber quote today, which, what did he compare? He said, remember that belief systems are not merely beliefs, they are the home of the ego. The ego needs beliefs. That tells you, by the way, the subtext of that is there's something in us that's deeper that doesn't need those things, those particular things. But anyway, he says it's the home of the ego, of self-contraction. And I love at the end, he says, when you challenge any belief system, the separate self experiences that as a death threat. Isn't that true? I promise you, I am not making this up. I was reading this week at the kitchen table. I was reading this. And my wife said to me, I'm not going to give you too much detail of this conversation, said something, we engaged in a conversation, and only in hindsight, I realized my belief systems were threatened. And I experienced this as a death threat as I was reading this. So you might think yourself to be enlightened. Oh, I'm above all that, until someone challenges your belief systems, and then it's a death threat. And then he says at the end here, when we do this, we're dealing with a cornered rat in others and in ourselves. I think it's important to remind ourselves of this reality. This is part of what makes the right and the left so polarizing. We're both cornered rats. The second, our belief system, which we're not even sure if we believe, gets poked. So I think values is at least a way of engaging the conversation about how do we want to live the good life without rooting it so strongly in the certainty of beliefs. Values are aspirational because, let's just read some of them. We respect the dignity and worth of every individual. I think I hold that value, yet I obviously don't always act like that. There are certain human beings I have a hard time honoring their dignity and worth without mentioning any names. So that's what I think is so interesting about C3. It is a very open community, but having a value like that is really challenging. It is. It's like, yeah, I want to remind myself of that every week. No, not really. I'd rather just be like a cornered rat and attacking people all the time. No. All right, so I might ask myself, how might I live this more fully in the coming year? Or today, for that matter. Something like common humanity. So anyway, I think, in other words, values are harder. They're harder. They're challenging. Common humanity, I wrote them all out somewhere. In my collection of notes, thank you. Where did I put those things? Oh, they're in the bulletin. Yeah, common humanity, diversity, open inquiry, compassionate action, environmental sustainability, and well-being. They're challenging, and that's part of the beauty of them. And I want to ask, when we start thinking future stuff, how might we live these more fully? How might we embody these? If they're just ideas, they're boring. You know? I'm glad you brought up Jesus this morning, Bernie, because he says so many things that are so challenging, that are action-oriented. Like he says to the rich person, he says, what must I do to inherit the kingdom of God? He says, well, sell everything that you have. That's not a metaphor. I mean, you can take it symbolically. That's a worthy path to go. But for that person, that wasn't like, oh, what an inspiration. I think I'll put that on a poster. No, it only can be embodied. Just like these, we can only embody our common humanity, or embody how we'd like to see diversity celebrated. So anyway, I'm saying C3, wonderfully open and welcoming, but even in our own values, it's also deeply challenging. So how might you allow yourself to be challenged here and dream this place forward, is what I'm asking. So I thought, if I have time, we're running a little late on time today, so maybe I'll just do a couple of these. I thought I'd just say, because I spent a lot of time with just reading these values, and thinking about them, and kind of asking, what do I hear? So I want to read them again, and at least three of them. I could probably do two or three here, and do the same. Like, what do I hear in this? Let me take it first personally. Like, what do I hear in this? How does this challenge me? What ideas might I have for how I might live this forward, or any of us live this forward, or something like that? So let's start with common humanity. We respect the dignity and worth of every human being. The dignity and worth of every human being. I heard something on the news this week, or I read something. It was a headline. Came across my phone. I opened my phone and I clicked on the news. And the headline said, "The markets are shaky because of the nuclear tensions between Pakistan and India." I thought to myself, that is a funny headline. That something as terrifying as global nuclear war, the headline is, "The markets are shaky." It tells you what our God is. The God is the market. It is. And what we've built with the market. The headline should be, "Terrifying global disaster involving the death of millions of people is shaky." That's the headline, not the markets. It actually reminded me of a rabbinic story. The rabbis have been brought up several times today, which makes me very happy. So there's a rabbinic story about the Tower of Babel. Remember the Tower of Babel? They get together and they say, "We're going to build a tower up, and that way we'll be remembered forever." It's kind of a quest for immortality. And the rabbis say, every time a human being fell to their death during the building of Babel, not a single tear was shed. But every time a brick fell and smashed, they said, "Woe unto us! Who will build another brick, and how quickly can it be made?" So don't tell me the Bible is completely irrelevant. That is very much the culture we're living in. How can we get the markets back on track? Anyway, now I'm sounding like a preacher. All right. Now, what does that have to do? This has to do with our value of common humanity. And by the way, this is part of our own psycho-spiritual evolution. Everybody starts off more egocentric. And from there, we gain a bit of our ethnocentricity, my tribe, my group. The hope is, and really for the first time ever, at least in a global sense, we're being invited to move into a more world-centric perspective. It's pretty easy to embrace the common humanity of your family. Well, some families. But at least of your tribe, your little mini culture. And maybe even a country, although that's becoming increasingly difficult. But a globe, that's the invitation of such. That's how big a statement like, "We respect the dignity and worth of every individual, no matter where they are, or where they live, or what group they're a part of." That is an evolution, a radical evolution in consciousness. And let's not forget it to be such. And by the way, egocentric, ethnocentric, world-centric, just because you've had a taste of a more world-centric perspective doesn't mean you're not going to, from time to time, behave like a cornered rat. You will. Consciousness moves up and down. We don't outgrow it and then be like, it's not for me anymore. I'm ego-free. It's the biggest line of BS I've ever heard, That is egocentric, Anyway, my point is, what a challenging invitation. How might we live this? And here in this culture, starting in West Michigan, starting here in Grand Haven, I think it's part of the invitation. Looking at the clock here. I'll say just a tiny bit on open inquiry here. What I hear in let's read it. Open inquiry: pursue the free exchange of ideas, explore the lessons of science, philosophy, and the creative arts, and undertake independent spiritual journeys. That's all. There's a lot in there. That's not like a small thing. There's a lot to explore. I hear also Socrates. The unexamined, or is it Socrates or Plato? I think it's Socrates. The unexamined life is not worth living. We're saying that out loud. That means, oh crap, I have to examine my own life. And we're going to do that publicly. I love when we have guests. First of all, I don't have to talk. but also, I'm challenged by them. I'm like, oh, okay. And that sort of like iron sharpens iron kind of image. We want to be a place like that, and we want to say yes to that, which means we're saying yes to having our ideas and our perspectives and even our individual journeys challenged from time to time in a spirit of openness. How might we embody that? How might we live that out in the coming year or years, I think, is what I'm poking around at. I'll give you one story from the church fathers. So Saint Anthony, he was a desert monk. He was really the first famous desert monk, if there was like such a thing. Well, he was famous enough where people left Alexandria in Egypt and went out to see him. Anyway, so a group comes to him, a group of students, and they say they gather around, and the students say, "Hey, we're having a hard time understanding this biblical passage. Who will explain it to us?" And one by one, starting from the youngest to the oldest of the monks, they explain the passage. So the young person goes, and the next person, the next person, the next person, the next person, and they're all explaining the passage. They get to the oldest person, and they say, "Tell us what you think." And he says, "I don't know." And St. Anthony says, "You have answered correctly." I think, or maybe it was said of Socrates, he was the wisest person who ever lived because he said, "I know that I don't know." That open inquiry, I think, is a bit of the ethos and the spirit of this place. I know that I don't know, so here we are, sharing in our unknowing, but also the desire to know, not in a nihilistic way. How might I learn, we might ask? And who might I learn from? What kinds of voices? What kinds of songs? What kinds of writings? What kinds of philosophy, religion, spirituality? I'm adding those. Science, the creative arts. That's one of the things that I think that makes this place unique. So what I want to do is take a quick time out. And I want to invite Dick up, and I want him to give us a snapshot of the next 4 weeks. So instead of talk back, I'll give a little talk, or someone will. We're going to gather together as a group, and we're going to work out some of these ideas. And I want to give you a preview of how that might go, and then I'll come back up and give you some homework assignments. Sound fair? Well, you shouldn't say, "I'm going to give you homework assignments," and then say, "Does it sound fair?"